Asset allocation is the process of determining both initially but also in an ongoing sense how much of your portfolio is exposed to broad asset classes like cash, fixed interest, property and shares. For most portfolios, they're managed using a strategic asset allocation, which means the exposures they have to those broad asset classes are consistent over time. In contrast to that, we use a dynamic approach to asset allocation, which means we can make quite big moves over time from overweights to underweights within those asset classes based on our expected returns and forecasts. My colleagues on the investment committee and I take a long-term approach to forecasting returns for each of the asset classes, and we think over long periods of time things can either get cheap or expensive, and so we position portfolios in that dynamic asset allocation framework to lean in the right direction, really to get away from those things that look expensive and are likely to produce poor returns, and to favour those asset classes and sectors that we think look particularly attractive, and to take an overweight position in those asset classes. So once my colleagues and I on the investment committee have determined our forecast for a particular asset class, we make a comparison between those risky asset classes like international and Australian shares and property, but also we make a comparison to a risk-free return. We look at what's available to an investor in the Australian environment, and that's like a term deposit from a major Australian bank at the moment, and we determine that if we're not going to be adequately compensated for the risk that we're taking on, we're very happy to go to zero in a risky asset class exposure. That's really at the heart of the philosophy of the dynamic asset allocation approach. So we determine asset class models, and then we blend those into programs based on the risk-return objectives that are identified for an investor by their financial advisor. So we have a range of programs for conservative investors through to those investors with a higher risk appetite, but each of those investors will have the same underlying exposure, just in different proportions depending on their risk profile and program that's been recommended to them. From time to time, we believe we can identify when things look very overpriced or when an asset class enters a bubble territory. And we believe as an investment committee that's about the most important thing we can do, is to identify those and to protect investors from the permanent damage that staying invested whilst a bubble corrects will wreak on their portfolio. So we can, via the forecasting process, one, we can identify when things look cheap, but equally we can identify when things look particularly expensive. And in terms of a long-term risk preservation approach to portfolio management, again, that's about the most important thing we think we can do for investors, is to get them out of the way of those bubbles.